Welcome to Mom in Mind, where we dive into all aspects of perinatal mental health and wellness related to pregnancy, birth, loss, postpartum, and new parenthood. It's so much more than postpartum depression. We raise the volume on all of these topics in the hopes that someday everyone will have the support and info that they deserve before they need it. Please note this podcast is not a replacement for treatment by a professional or professional training. Welcome to Mom in Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. We have a really interesting and special episode this week. We are talking with Nyna Giles, who is the author of The Bridesmaid's Daughter, a deeply personal memoir about family, mental health, and revisiting the past. We are going to be able to hear perspective on what it was like as a child for Nyna to grow up with a mother who had mental illness, and looking back on it, now knows that she had an untreated postpartum psychosis. Back then, there wasn't a lot of knowledge or support for mothers going through any type of perinatal crisis. And so we get to hear from Nyna's perspective, what it was like growing up, and what she reflected on as an adult, that she then shares with us through The Bridesmaid's Daughter. Nyna is the youngest daughter of Carolyn Scott Reybold, a Ford model best known as one of Grace Kelly's bridesmaids. Nyna has worked with leading media organizations, and today she is the COO of Giles Communications. She's an advocate for the mentally ill, traveling the globe to share her story, revealing the challenges brought on by her mother's untreated mental illness, and her own lost childhood and education. Nyna is a board member of NAMI Westchester and serves on the NAMI New York State Legislative Committee. She's also a volunteer with Postpartum Resource Center of New York. Nyna lives in Westchester with her husband and has 3 grown children and 3 stepchildren. I hope that you will enjoy and learn from this fascinating story and reflection through the past, and take some of these lessons with us into the future. So let's hear from Nyna. Welcome, Nyna. Thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
I'm very interested in your story, hearing more about your book, and really fascinated, as I mentioned before we started recording, the kind of historical aspect and your experience as a daughter of someone who went through a postpartum mental illness. It's a perspective we haven't really been able to dig into yet here on the podcast, but I know it's something that a lot of people go through. So I'm really grateful that you're willing to come on and share your story.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess start wherever feels like the start to you.
Well, I wrote my book, The Bridesmaid's Daughter, to tell my mother's story. I knew that untreated mental illness was at the core, and I really wanted to uncover the truth to really fully understand and appreciate what my mother went through in a way that I could share with the world. In order to do that, I also had to face what happened to me as a child, which has been very painful to relive. Just a little background. My mother was a very successful Ford model in the late 1940s through the mid-1950s, best friend and bridesmaid to Grace Kelly. She led a very glamorous life, and it was really only after she passed away in 2007 that I was finally able to understand what had happened, to go back to the past in search of the woman my mother had been before I was born. She was a small town girl who made it big, considered an icon of Steubenville, Ohio. She won a contest in 1947 that gave her the money to go to New York City, where she met a young Grace Kelly, and it was there that she pursued a modeling career.
Fascinating. And what happened from there for her?
Well, she was very successful. Her career in modeling lasted about 8 years. She was instantly recognizable by her face, if not her name. And she married my father. Actually, it was Grace that introduced my parents on a blind date. And they had a really good life. My 2 sisters, everything was fine. My mother went back to work after both of my sisters. And then they decided to build the dream house on Long Island. And at that point, that isolated my mother, and she gave up her career.
Okay.
So that represented a big change for her in her life.
Oh, wow. Okay. So at that point, you hadn't been born yet?
No.
So she was a little bit more isolated out there?
Yes. I mean, they had a beautiful home, 5 acres of waterfront property. Everything was wonderful. My, sisters had all of the best, things. They went to horseback riding classes and dance classes, and seemingly everything was fine. But so she had many of the risk factors that would have contributed to developing, postpartum health issues. The year that I was born was a very difficult one for my mother. My birth was traumatic. My mother was a petite 5'4". I was a 10-pound, 10-ounce baby.
Oh.
She had a C-section, which was her third, and woke up to find out that she had also had a hysterectomy.
Oh, gosh.
She was in the hospital for more than a week. It seems to me, what I've been able to find out could be about 10 days based on how long she was away. She had, given up her career, isolated on Long Island. Her family was in Ohio, her friends in New York City, just far from everybody who would have noticed any changes in her behavior.
Mm-hmm.
People would come to visit, but the visits were short. And that very same year, my mother found out that my father had an affair when I was just 9 months old.
Mm-hmm.
So it was really the perfect storm of things, going wrong in her life and not enough support. My father was really, I've tried very hard to be fair to all sides of this story, but he really wasn't a supportive partner to her at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that contributed, there's narcissistic types of behavior, really not helpful to her. And she knew there was something wrong. That year, she was secretly seeing a psychiatrist in the city. But when my father found out, he refused to pay for the visits, insisting that she see a psychiatrist of his choosing, which she never did. Yeah. And then when I was a teenager, my father told me that we would have hated him if he had committed her. So instead, I was hidden away with her.
Wow. How do you mean? Can you say more about hidden away with her?
Well, part of my story really is my lack of formal education. So in my mother's care, the only full year of education that I had was 7th grade, if you can imagine that. Think of all the things a child would miss from not going to elementary school. No sense of accomplishment, no friendships, no sense of belonging and fitting in. I have no class pictures. Mm-hmm. It wasn't until I was 10 years old that there was a petition for educational neglect. But even that, after that, it wasn't enforced.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
But, I've explored with this, every possible avenue with therapists, the top mental health professionals. This was not Munchausen syndrome by proxy. You could say I had school phobia, which would be accurate. But if I had been out of her care and influence, I would have been fine. I think I was afraid to leave her. I think I was worried about her. And so we were sort of trapped in this cycle of dysfunction, where I probably said I had a stomach ache and she would be overprotective and overreact to it.
This is from birth for you? In terms of like the stories you've heard and what people have told you, what you remember, her behavior was this way from birth?
Well, as far as like the very, very early years, I did over 100 interviews when I wrote the book. So, I was able to go back to friends and family members. For instance, she would call my grandmother, talking about things that really sounded like psychosis that weren't real. Mm-hmm. And my sisters were 6 and 8 years older than me, so I learned a lot from them. And then I also have my school records, which were extensive, if you can imagine, because of all of the absences.
Oh, gotcha.
And I also got my sister's school records, and there were interesting notes in there as well. Mm-hmm. And I was, going back to friends, like a friend of my sister said, you were like a beautiful porcelain doll, a non-entity. You never left your mother's side.
These are people's observations and recollections. And was that your experience as well?
Yes. But as far as the very early years, I had to rely on things I heard from other people and doctors and friends and all of that. And then, but by age 4 or 5, I do have my own memories.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in your book, do you go into some of that, what your memories were with her?
Oh, yes. About my childhood. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of a glimpse or perspective? It sounds like looking back, the kind of diagnosis, looking back in time is related to postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. Is that accurate?
Yes. Well, I never really knew about that. I didn't know much about postpartum depression or postpartum psychosis. I never heard about it when I had my own children. But the biggest surprise, in writing the book The only diagnosis I had heard about my mother was paranoid schizophrenia, which she received in her 50s. And so how accurate could that really be? And so I was looking for an expert on schizophrenia, and that led me to Jeffrey Lieberman, chair of psychiatry at Columbia. And I was very fortunate to be able to spend time with him and sharing her story and everything that I knew, because I thought maybe it was some special kind of schizophrenia or something, because I knew, the one thing I knew from all of my interviews is that the change in my mother took place after my birth. It's so evident in the pictures. I asked people if they noticed anything before I was born, and it was all afterward.
Okay, with that as a context, of understanding what might have been going on for her, what was it like for you? If you can give a couple of examples of things you share, what was it like for you as a child?
Well, as a child, I never felt really connected with her. I never felt that I had the same bond with her that my sisters had. My mother even told me that in the hospital she couldn't hold me, and that was because of the massive incision, that she would have had because of that surgery.
Oh, sure.
And in my memory, she's just always there, but turning away. I don't have this feeling of ever really being connected with her. But I don't think of it as something where she didn't love me or anything like that. I just feel like she just didn't have it to give because she was really not well.
Well, did you get that sense as a child that she wasn't well?
Yes. And things, there were things that she said, and, it changed as I got older because I started to challenge things that she'd been telling me, that just didn't make sense. She would say things, even when I was very young, she would say things like, they said, or, well, who's they? And I could never get an answer, but I didn't understand that.
Sure.
And then, she would, there were things that happened when I was very young where she'd just pick up and take me, in the middle of the night on, to see her mother, just things that were really very odd. It did not feel as a child like I never felt really safe for my emotions, or there's always this fear growing up. I grew up with a lot of fear, and I think that's related to what she was going through. Part of it, also not being in a good marriage.
Oh, sure.
The way that my father treated her. I did, growing up, witness examples of violence,
Right. So the home environment itself wasn't safe. And then also the feeling with your mom specifically wasn't of safety.
Yeah, it was a lot of uncertainty and things, just not making sense. I was very clingy at a very young age. And I don't think she encouraged me to separate. But it's so complicated because at the same time, I didn't feel close to her. It took years to kind of work through that.
Right. I'm sure. I mean, there's only so much you can know as a child. There's just no way to have the context for what is actually going on until you're older and can put those pieces together.
Right.
Right. So in terms of how her untreated mental illness impacted you as a child, these are like foundational and fundamental years to have a connection like that feels necessary, but not totally safe. Over time, I guess, how did that impact you as you went through childhood?
Well, being home all of that time and not being in school, that had a tremendous impact. It's taken me years. People will say now, oh, you're so well adjusted, you're so fine, you're social, you're this, you're that. But it took me years of pretending that I was okay, and I really wasn't okay.
Sure.
And I had a lot of social anxiety when I was younger, even in my 20s, even after I was away from her. I actually left home at age 14 because at that point, my sister, who left very young also, came home for a visit, and she sat me down and she said, that my mother wasn't well. And she said, do you realize that you were never sick all those years, that you should have been in school? And once somebody said it out loud, there was no way I could go back.
Sure.
It wasn't about being angry at her, really. I just couldn't be with her.
Yeah.
She was still part of my life. It took, time to work through all of it because I really didn't understand mental illness and what it was doing to her.
Sure. And I imagine nobody around her did either.
No. In those days, nobody talked about it. It was something that you stayed away from. And so, again, I think it started after I was born, and she never got the treatment. So she just continued to decline over the years, her mental health.
That's hard.
We did have a nanny when I was very young, and I think maybe that helped her maybe it would have been worse, this scenario, if she hadn't at least had that.
So that you had mentioned before, she tried to go to a psychiatrist, or she did go to a psychiatrist. So somebody kind of made some sort of assessment. She was taking medication at the time?
I really don't know. I remember hearing about Valium but I really can't be sure about any of that, how she was being treated. I just don't, those records I don't have.
Sure. So she knew something was going on and was trying to attend to it the best that she could.
Yes.
Oh, gosh.
And
so, the home life was complicated. It sounds like when you're talking about it, there was a lot of you and her, but your sister was around somewhere and your dad was around somewhere. But the main thing was how much, I guess this is my perspective on it, how much she needed you around.
Yes. I think there's something to be said about that. I know my therapist, actually, she was in ordinary circumstances. Mother would not want the trouble her all day.
Right.
But I think we sort of kept each other company in a way. I think she was very lonely and very sad. And my sisters were 6 and 8 years older. So for them, it was completely different. My father worked in the city and then really wasn't around much. At a certain point, he started just staying in the city. He had an office and he would just stay there. He didn't want to deal with her. He even told me that he would literally pull over on the side of the road and throw up before he came home.
Whoa.
That's how stressful it was. And he never knew, who he was coming home to. But during that time, there were people on the outside that wouldn't have even known.
Was your mom's behavior around other people different than it was at home?
I think she could sort of hold it together, but she didn't get involved. She was not involved with the school. She didn't make new friends. There was only one friend that I remember that we spent time with, and that's it. She really didn't participate a lot. She was just there. In fact, a neighbor of ours called her the little woman down the hill.
Raise your hand if you take a multivitamin, and then raise your hand if you know what's in it. What about taking a multivitamin where you can actually see what's in it? Ritual is the obsessively researched multivitamin designed for women by women. It contains 9 nutrients that are difficult to get enough of every day, even with a healthy diet. Instead of taking a handful of 5 to 8 vitamins, Ritual makes it easy with 2 capsules a day. Order online at ritual.com for around $1 a day. Ritual is delivered to your door monthly so you can stay on track with your new healthy habit. Ritual is traceable and transparent. They search the globe for the best suppliers and are transparent about where they source their ingredients. If you want to know more, you can find everything on the website. Easy, all-in-one, everything I want. That's why Ritual is the daily vitamin I choose. When I take my vitamins in the morning with my food, I know what I'm getting throughout the day to help me stay on top of it all. You can try Ritual today because you'll get an exclusive offer for 10% off your first 3 months. Visit ritual.com/momandmind to start your Ritual today. That's 10% off your first 3 months at ritual.com/momandmind. Just really, really isolated and isolating you with her, which I'm sure impacted a lot. And when you're in your own head in that kind of a way, and then also isolated, it's really hard to be kind of checked by reality or what would the rest of us assume is reality.
Yeah.
It's a hard place to be in because you're like double isolated, both just internally and literally. That's really hard. So this was years until you left, but also years afterwards.
Yes. So I left at age 14 and, there was a settlement a few years later, a divorce settlement. She had an apartment in the city. And then I lived in the Virgin Islands as a teenager. I went from age 17 to 20. So I only saw her once during that time, maybe. She came to visit with my sister. And then sort of after that point, when I was in my 20s and, married and having children, when things really got bad with her, she gave away all of her money. And eventually, after wandering. It doesn't, when somebody becomes homeless, I don't think it necessarily happens overnight.
Mm-hmm.
But she found herself in 1985, and she had been taken to the hospital because she was having some kind of psychotic episode. Mm-hmm. And it was Kings County Psychiatric Hospital in New York, and they sent her to a shelter at the New York Armory, the Park Avenue Armory, or now I guess it's called Lenox Hill Neighborhood House. And they have a shelter there for women 55 and older with a diagnosis of mental illness. And she was there for quite some time, but she refused medication and, offers to help with housing. People offered her places to live, but she would just give her things away. And it's so sad because at that point, it was so late to start treating her. I just believe firmly that if she had been treated the year after I was born, it would have changed the trajectory of our family's entire life.
Oh, you are 100% right. She would have had the help she needed. It's really, really hard to look back and see that things could have been so different for all of you.
It's very painful. And I will say, people always say when you write a book like this, has it, been cathartic? And it has. I think it's given me a chance to be the best me that I can be, the most authentic. I'm not ashamed of what happened. I'm not ashamed that I didn't go to school or what happened with my mother. I can talk about it openly, and that's very empowering. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, and as an advocate, I live in that space of pain, a lot. And it's hard, but it's just balance. You have to balance it and limit how much you allow yourself to feel that pain. That's what I do. I look at it like that.
Yeah, that sounds really, really healthy. And like you said, it sounds like you took some work to get to that point.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things to figure out before you can get to that point. So you were saying a little bit before that while you were having kids, this was going on for your mom. She was in the shelter. What was that like for you becoming a mother with, reflecting back on your time with your own mom, and how did your transition to motherhood go for you?
Well, I think I always wanted to be a mother. And I think there was this part of me that just wanted to be a good mother. I wanted to be the PTA mother, the mother I never had. I was a stay-home mom until my youngest was 5. And I really had that opportunity, class mother of all 3 kids' classes at the same time, making the cupcakes, helping with the homework and doing all of, birthday parties and everything that I felt that I didn't have. And I enjoyed every minute of it. And today, my kids are 27 to 35, 3 kids, and I have 3 stepchildren as well. And I'm close with every single one of them, talk to them almost every day. But as a mother, initially it was just exciting and wonderful and all of that. But when my kids became school age, then we started to have some problems because I started thinking, wait a minute. I started thinking about all those years where I just sort of buried it and I just went on to survive. Survival mode. And so I got my school records when my 2 oldest, they were like maybe 5 and 2.5, one just going into kindergarten. And I told my husband, I have to go to Long Island. I have to get my school records. I need to understand what happened to me. It can't be as bad as I remember. Wow. It was worse.
Oh, no.
Actually worse.
Wow.
Yeah, 175 days, that's the equivalent of 1 school year. So I would go to school for 30 days, maybe 45 on a good year, and then just not go back, or 1 year not go at all. That part was very painful with my kids because I'd just look at them and I couldn't understand how could that happen? How did my father allow it?
Right.
How did the school district allow it?
Right.
Yeah.
And nobody was checking on you, seeing if you were okay, or
they tried, but in such a lame way, really. They would call the house, and then when they pushed her hard, she'd take me to a doctor, and just say, well, she hasn't been feeling well. And some of the things she talked to me about, I'm sure that those were delusions, internal bleeding and bizarre things that she said that I had. But it was never something that she caused. That to me is a very important distinction.
Sure.
It wasn't like she was poisoning me or giving me a feeding tube or saying I needed unnecessary surgeries. It wasn't like that at all.
Right. So all delusions. You were, from other people's account, I guess from what your sister said, you were never sick all those years.
Yeah, that just floored me because nobody had ever said it out loud. I was essentially living a lie. How do you, as a young child, internalize that and understand it? And how did I even know?
Right.
I talk about an example in the book where it was, it was like the first day of school, and I told my mother, I had chest palpitations. I could hear my heart beating, and she said, I can hear it too. And the next thing I know, we're going to a cardiologist. That's not normal. Most parents would just say, you're nervous. It's okay.
Yes. Okay. So you spent I believe you said about 5 years researching and writing and going through all of this information and discovery. What are the things that you came away with for yourself in all of this discovery?
Well, most important was to understand, what really happened to my mother. And, I believe the meeting with Jeffrey Lieberman really clarified that for me, because when I shared everything with him, he said, you're not describing schizophrenia. What you've described to me is, are the symptoms of postpartum psychosis. And if she was never treated, she would have just continued to deteriorate. So one of the things that was very helpful in understanding what happened to my mother, I spoke with one of the leading experts on postpartum psychosis, Dr. Diana Barnes. And she said that as a model, your mother's whole persona was about femininity and beauty. So the hysterectomy would have been particularly hard for her, that she would have felt that she lost part of what made her a woman. She also had asked me if my mother experienced any trauma in childhood, and at least 6 people from different areas of my mother's life told me that they thought that she was sexually abused by her stepfather.
Mm-hmm.
So, that definitely would have been a risk factor. And, also I spoke with my OBGYN, and he said after such a traumatic surgery, it's highly unlikely that your mother could have escaped some kind of postpartum depression.
Yeah, especially with a hysterectomy and all that sudden hormonal shift, if she already, was in this fragile state.
Right. Yeah, that my birth was the fork in the road, the turning point in her life from which she never recovered, and through no fault of her own.
Right. Thank you for adding that in. Right. I'm sure back then, too, if people were talking, it was all about blaming her or shaming her.
Oh, absolutely.
Unfortunately, hasn't shifted a whole lot other than, those of us who know better. But the general public still does this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is that I had saved a magazine about the Andrea Yates story from years ago. And I don't save magazines, but that story just had such an impact on me. And I remember thinking, I just understood what it was like, for a mother to have delusions, and really believe them. And so I just couldn't look at her as a monster. I wanted to help her, comfort her, because I just thought, I understand how it could be that real. And, I couldn't even talk to anybody about it at the time. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing is that I actually met George Parnham at the PSI conference, not this year, but last year. And I had a chance to share. Yeah, I had a chance to share those feelings with him, which was really meaningful to me. Yeah. So.
Well, that's phenomenal. I mean, you've uncovered so much of her story in a way, kind of put her together in a way that she couldn't do for herself to make sense of things that she was lost in. It's quite a feat and speaks to, even though things were difficult, your connection in some way.
In some way. And it's been a wonderful thing too. Part of what I did was I researched her career, and now I can feel proud of her instead of being ashamed of this mother that lived in a shelter. Now I just have such a different feeling about her. I feel so much love towards her, and I'm proud of what she accomplished as a young woman. If I hadn't gone on this journey, I never would have been able to have those feelings, which are really important to my well-being.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. Yeah. And it's quite a journey. I'm really grateful that you've done this for multiple reasons. One, I'm just so happy for you that you have this like sense of peace in relation to your mom. And also it is beneficial to the rest of us to really get a sense of, for those of us who are, having kids now, or people who had parents with mental illness that they couldn't quite figure out what was going on. I mean, it just, you're giving context to, I'm sure, a lot of people that might be helpful for them in their own healing journey.
I hope so. I have gotten a lot of messages from people, and it just makes you feel so good if you can help somebody else, because every story is so unique and every perspective is important.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I'll be sure to direct everybody to all of your links and to be able to find information about the book and the website, and so they can read through all the beautiful work you've done. But it would also be great, before we close up, to hear from you what you really hope people hear and what you'd like to leave people with today.
I believe when it comes to mental health, we can all help by engaging in real conversations and asking if somebody's okay, if they appear to be struggling. Even when the journey to write my book got too dark, a good friend of mine encouraged me to see a therapist. And, the smallest act can change someone's life. And, with mothers and children, I, see it all the time, where all the attention goes to the baby. We need to pay attention to mothers and ask them how they're doing. And, for me, from being on this journey, when I see mothers, I really see them now.
Yeah.
I know, in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate, everything that mothers do.
Yeah, thank you for that. It seems simple enough to really ask a question like, how are you really doing? And to keep a close eye.
Mm-hmm.
But wow, it doesn't happen enough. And people are still slipping through the cracks. So I appreciate your perspective there, and hope that people can hear that and use that. It's simple, but effective. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for your time. I will direct everyone to your website where they can find more information about the book and see some of the interviews you've done. And again, thank you so much for your time and for all of the work you put into this, and for letting us see a glimpse into your life and your mom's life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you once again, Nyna, for taking us on this journey with you. And I know there are so many more details in this memoir that I'm sure so many people can resonate with. For the listeners, if you'd like to learn more, go to thebridesmaidsdaughter.com and get this book. You can also connect with Nyna on Facebook and Instagram at Nyna Giles Author, or find her on Twitter. I'm sure there are other experiences that you all listeners have had of having a parent with untreated perinatal mental health challenges. I hope Nyna's story serves as comfort and education and information to you. For those of you who are new to the Mom and Mind podcast, please do subscribe so you can get each of these episodes downloaded to you directly when they come out. And be sure to share these episodes with people who could benefit from them, so they know that they're not alone in their journey either. Thank you for being with us. Until next time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please share this podcast. Together we can support moms and families so that no one has to deal with this alone. Come connect with us at momandmind.com.